Guidelines are very helpful in the context of textual requirements documentation because, first of all, they help you to make requirements easy to read and thus easy to understand. The style guides also often handle most frequent problems that can occur, and they help have some of the project-specific extensions to make the document even more readable in the context of your specific projects. What is also be advisable is that the directives should be consolidated in the company's specific style guide. So either from your side as a requirements engineer working in a certain field like healthcare, or from the company that is contracting you, so from your customers. So the guidelines or the style guides often have like certain best practices or recommendations. So one of the most common ones is having short sentences because of the limitation of the human short-term memory. And also long sentences require long and complex sentence structures, which make it more complicated to understand. And as we just said in the previous slide, you want to have it like as easy to read and understand as possible. Next, you should only describe one requirement per sentence and try to avoid something like "and" where you concatenate multiple sentences together. Sometimes it is necessary, but try to avoid it. Also, avoid jargon and use abbreviations sparingly. Yes, you have a glossary where we explain abbreviations, but just imagine a sentence with 10 abbreviations where you have to look up each abbreviation and then reconstruct that sentence. So keep it short. Also, try to keep the requirements in itself or in themselves short and try to stick to short paragraphs, like maximum 7 sentences. Where applicable, use lists instead of listing sentences because lists are easier to comprehend. Use terminology consistent. Repetitions of word is welcome. This is not a novel, this is not some Hollywood script, so it is fine in this context. And as we have already seen before, nested logic terms are difficult, so avoid them. So if X or Y is given in case that, but not, don't make it that complicated. If it is applicable and if you can do that and if this is fine for all stakeholders, you could use something like pseudocode or decision tables. Just make sure that everyone understands it. So common language, we talked about that before. And here we have a bad and a good example. The bad on top. Users attempting to access the ABC database should be reminded by a system message that will be acknowledged and by page headings on all reports that the data is sensitive and access is limited by their system privileges. While reading this sentence, I already forgot the first word of that sentence, so it's definitely not a good way to write down requirements. A better way to do so is shown below, where you start structuring and splitting the requirement into different pieces. So structuring using listings like numbers. 4.1, the system shall notify users attempting to access the ABC database that, and now you have a last list of what shall be notified about. The ABC data is classified sensitive. That's the first thing you're going to be notified. Second, access to the ABC data is limited according to the user's system's privileges. It's the second information. And third, page headings on all reports generated using the ABC database must state that report contains sensitive information. This is way easier to present those 3 information using that style instead of the one above. And 4.1.1, the system shall require the user to acknowledge the notification before being allowed to access the ABC database. Much better, much clearer, less confusing. So you get the idea. Moreover, use words like must, can, ought, should, is carefully, because they could be indicators that this is a mandatory requirement if you use them in this way. So for example, the system must do something or ought to do something. What you can also do is when you use those words, first clarify how they are supposed to be used to separate mandatory from optional requirements through a definition of those attributes. You can also use chapter headings to support this differentiation. It's also helpful to use active instead of passive voice. So a result is displayed is less clear than the system displays the result, because then you already get the actor who is displaying what. Also illustrate complex dependencies with graphics. This is where we now draw the connection, for example, to the model-based documentation that will follow. Use precise references, use an automatic spell checker. All of those also help to foster the understanding and readability of the requirements document. Furthermore, express requirements so they are testable. So when you have a requirement and you implement it, how do you know whether the requirement was implemented? So it makes it easier for you. Is it possible to create a test case for a certain requirement? If not, try to rephrase it or to work on it until you have a test case. It's not always possible, but it's easier in the long run. State a rationale for each requirement. The rationale is important as a basis for deciding upon changes or omissions of requirement during the development, but also when you have contradictions, for example, like why do we have this requirement in the first place? Why did we decide to omit it? Tracing is something that we touched before and will touch again later. Explanations in requirements are confusing. So there's a bad example and a good example. To enable an experienced user to work efficiently, the access authorization is also checked on double-clicking a list item, and if this authorization is valid, the customer-specific data will be displayed in access field. In case the SQL query returns an error code -1, better solution, make those explanations explicit. And finally, try to avoid generalities, because usually they lead to ambiguities, as we have already discussed before, or there's just not really information in there. So here's an example where you have statement input masks should be displayed entirely on screen. Scrolling should be avoided if possible. This is a principle of graphical user interface design, ! So the last sentence is completely unnecessary and just adds text that no one needs. So generality, avoid them. And document the sources. Sources could be persons or documents for all the requirements. I think we covered that before, and also when we talk about traceability, we'll get back to this. But in the elicitation phase, you had to check where did your requirements come from. For a large number of requirements or after a certain period of time, it is difficult to remember a source if the requirements must be changed. So that is either over a time period or in large and complex projects. You usually do not have a single person who remembers and knows everything, especially if over a period of time people change. And there are also guidelines for technical terms. Why technical terms should be defined is probably self-explanatory, because what do they mean is relevant for the requirements document. And the advantage or the goal is to avoid misunderstandings caused by following phenomena, like unclear terms where some people don't know what it means. The person who doesn't know something could also be you as a requirement engineer who's not familiar with certain domain terms, like what is a butterfly valve. Also, ordinary terms may have special meanings to clients or users, like what's an article, what's a call. And different terms for the same thing could be used in the context of synonyms. They could be used by different sources or because the vocabulary of concepts of a client is not yet defined. And there are also same terms for related but still different things. So a school equals the institution or a specific school. So just as an example, the Werner von Siemens School in Hildesheim.